Hi, my name is Anne Crooks. I worked under the direction of Professor Kristine Muñoz, and the title of our project is Moravia Resiste, Resistance and Land Use in Colombia. My objective for this project was to study innovative policies being implemented in Colombia and their effects on the communities that these policies were created to benefit. To approach this research, I set out to answer the following sets of questions. First, what is social urbanism policy? What policies has it produced in Medellin, Colombia, and for what purpose? Second, what is the Moravia Resiste movement, and what is its role in the public response to new policies in Medellin? Our research studies Moravia, a neighborhood in the northeast sector of Medellin. Medellin is the second largest city in Colombia with a population of 3 million. The population of the Moravia neighborhood is around 48,000. You can find Moravia and Comuna 4 in the map of Medellin on the right. Comunas refer to different neighborhood boundaries that make up Medellin, much like the Bronx neighborhood in New York City or Lincoln Park in Chicago. To answer our questions, I first consulted primary resources collected by Professor Kristine Muñoz. Principal among these resources was an interview conducted with two Moravita high school students, Leslie and Angie. These two women recounted the history of the Moravia Resiste movement from the 1970s to today while giving a tour of Moravia. We'll hear more from this tour and interview later on. To supplement the history told by Leslie and Angie, I utilized photos, videos, and other archival materials from El Centro de Desarrollo Cultural de Moravia, or Moravia's Cultural Development Center. To understand the complex constitutional and legislative history of Colombia and Medellin, I consulted Colombian lawyer Jose Luis Lugo Correa. I examined primary resources including the Colombian Constitution of 1991, Ley 9 de 1989, Ley 388 de 1997, and the Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial, or the Municipal Land Use Plan of Medellin. In order to understand community effects of these policies and public response, I looked to local news articles. And to draw conclusions on social urbanism policy and its implementation in Medellin, I consulted scholarly articles in the field of urban planning and policy implementation. In order to understand the Moravia Resiste movement today, you have to go back to the 1970s when the settlement of the area began. The 70s in Colombia were characterized by fighting among left and right-wing militarists. And as these groups began to move their conflicts to the countrysides of Colombia, the people living in the rural areas were forced to flee from the violence. Many chose to migrate to city centers such as Medellin, hoping to find safety and security. However, when they arrived, they found that there were no places to live and work in the city center, so they settled in the municipal garbage dump of the city across the river from where they were dropped off. As fighting continued and economic conditions worsened through the 1980s, settlement in and around the dump continued. Without access to electricity, transportation, or employment, survival was difficult. To make money, settlers sorted through refuse for materials that could be sold, and building materials were collected from the garbage to make homes like the ones pictured here. Essential to surviving was mutual support throughout the community. What little food and water could be accessed was shared by all community members, so no family was left behind. Despite every effort of the community to ensure survival, living conditions on the dump were poor, as depicted in this photo. The photos shown here are from the archives of the Moravia Cultural Development Center. Ifigenia Valesquez was a central figure of the history of Moravia, and we'll hear more from her later on. Quotes from Ifigenia and other leaders are drawn from a documentary that was made to show the history of Moravia, made in 2012 by Un Corto Taller. By 1983, the growing population of the dump neighborhood brought the attention of the local government, and in response, open-air dumping was made illegal and the Moravia dump was closed. Fires were not an uncommon occurrence in Moravia as a result of the methane gas being released from the huge deposits of garbage underground. But as fires began to occur more frequently and without explanation, some began to suspect that they were set intentionally by the local government as another relocation strategy. Two fires, one taking place in 2007 and another in 2017, were particularly devastating to the community. Many suspected that it wasn't a coincidence that each fire took place in local focus areas of the government at the time. Those displaced by these fires were provided 3 months of rental assistance, but without a home to return to, most were forced to move under a local city bridge. Following the end of left and right-wing conflicts in Colombia, there was a public push for social interests to be recognized under the law. This push led to two important pieces of legislation, the first being Ley 9 de 1989, or Law 9 of 1989. This law permits government acquisition of private property for the purpose of public utility, much like eminent domain laws in the United States. One principal use of public land was to be for public housing units called viviendas de interés social, to address the high population of homeless and displaced peoples in Colombia at the time. However, we'll see how this law in practice has displaced the Moravita community. The second piece of legislation was a new constitution signed in 1991. It's often referred to as the Human Rights Constitution for its focus on public interest and its establishment of a participatory democracy in Colombia. One important aspect of the Human Rights Constitution is the extensive list of social, economic, and cultural rights laid out in Title II. In the context of new legislation and a commitment to ensuring individual rights, the local government of Medellin sent police forces to clear out the Moravia community in the interest of public health concerns. These efforts by the government resulted in brutal violence against the settlers. Police monitored the area for expansion, destroying homes, businesses, and valuable building materials as they went. Community members were met with unprovoked violence where they suffered beatings from the police. It wasn't uncommon for a Moravita community member to disappear without a trace. After years of fighting to survive in the dump without any assistance from the national or local governments, the Moravia community refused to be separated from one another, nor let their history of resilience and innovation be erased. And so, the Moravia Resiste movement was born. Hortensia Durango was another important leader in the Moravia Resiste movement. Resistance in Moravia took many forms. Community members came together to resist government intervention and avoid confrontations with the police. Tracking police whereabouts and distracting officials from their removal duties were strategies used to continue the expansion of the neighborhood. In the face of fragmentation and erasure, Moravitas responded by celebrating their culture, derived from their shared experience of displacement and survival. Pictured here is one such celebration. Weekly festivals were not only to celebrate, but also to bring the community together to discuss how to face problems they faced, as well as to pool resources to provide everyone with the necessities to survive. Art and theater were tools to use to express frustration with the government and the conditions of life for Moravitas. Listen to a resistance song sung by Ifigenia Velasquez.
Mira los que sufrimos en las basuras, todos llenos de roto las vestiduras. Nos ofrecen casita, buena comida y buenos empleos. Al pueblo no lo engañen, maldita sea, maldita sea.
Moravia Resiste graffiti like this can be found throughout the neighborhood. Today, tourists come to Moravia to take tours of this resistance art. Since the 1960s, Moravia has undergone a total transformation. One of the most impressive transformations is that of the Moro, or the former mountain of garbage that sat at the center of the Moravia dump. Through a series of ecological innovations, the Moro has been transformed into a giant hilltop garden, serving as both a public space and environmental solution to the hazardous materials that are piled below. These dramatic transformations can be largely attributed to the vision of former mayor of Medellin, Sergio Fajardo. Fajardo is pictured here in 2016. In 2004, Sergio Fajardo developed what is now called social urbanism, or the Medellin model. Social urbanism is a form of urban planning policy that aims to provide better services to the most underserved neighborhoods in the city through a series of public projects that upgrade and beautify the area. This goal is achieved by implementing policies coming from the national government or top-down implementation, as well as bottom-up implementation, where policies are derived from the population that they intend to benefit. Fajardo's focus on using urban development to solve social justice issues faced by Medellin was praised internationally, earning the city several urban planning awards, including the Kristine Design Prize in 2009 and the Urban Institute's Most Innovative City of the Year award in 2012, beating out cities like Paris and New York City that year. Public projects like these helped Medellin earn its urban planning accolades. Medellin is often referred to as a miracle city for its transformation and is considered to be best practice in humanitarian urban planning policy. As laid out in Colombian law, these projects were intended to benefit the most underserved community members of Medellin, namely Moravitas and others who had been historically displaced and oppressed. However, a closer examination of the outcomes of these policies will reveal several unintended consequences that once again threaten the displacement of Moravitas. There are two primary consequences of social urbanism policies that threaten Moravitas today. The first is gentrification. The unique history and culture of Moravia has introduced a wave of tourism into the area. Today, tourists come to Moravia to enjoy sites such as the Moro, Resiste street art, or the nearby botanical gardens. In addition to tourism, Moravia's proximity to metro stations, as well as its development of public projects, have made Moravia a popular and trendy place to live. Colombia utilizes a system of subsidies to determine the taxes and utility prices of an area. The improvements made to the land of Moravia have put it into a higher tax and utility bracket, making the neighborhood unaffordable to live in for Moravitas. In addition to the slow-moving threat of gentrification, there are also more immediate threats to the community, namely the execution of public projects in the area that require private property. Most threatening of these projects is the Autopista Al Maruno. This is a project proposed under the most recent land use plan of Medellin. The project is a superhighway that will connect Medellin with other popular tourist destinations around Colombia and streamline traffic to popular neighborhoods such as Moravia. The construction of the highway will displace many Moravitas remaining in the area into government-built public housing units. The local government's solution to the displacement of Moravitas is to move them into the Ciudadela Nuevo Occidente that is pictured here. This structure is able to hold the entire population of Moravia with a capacity of 80,000. However, those being forced into these units find themselves once again in poor living conditions. The units are not only too small for most families, they're also poor quality, more closely resembling a large jail cell than an apartment. In addition, these units are placed on the far outskirts of the city, nearly 90 minutes away from Moravia. In the areas where public housing is built, there's little access to jobs, infrastructure, and social services that are being developed in the city center. As a result, the poorest individuals are being locked out of the city and are unable to enjoy the neighborhood upgrades in Moravia that have been developed under social urbanism. This resistance graffiti refers to a movement called Gentrification no es el nombre de una señora, led by left-hand rotation. This group conducts research on urban colonization and gentrification in cities and does community advocacy. Pictured here is Mafalda, a readily recognized figure of resistance throughout the Spanish-speaking world. The left-hand rotation would identify the threats facing Moravia as urban colonization. This is a three-step process in which dangerous or unpopular neighborhoods are targeted for intervention and then gentrified. The first step is stigmatization and abandonment. This step took place between 1980 and 1990 as the dump of Moravia was determined unsafe to live in by the government. The second phase of colonization began in 2004 as the local government invested in neighborhood upgrading and public projects. As described by Leslie and Angie, speculation has led to unaffordable taxes and rent in the Moravia neighborhood. Today, Moravitas find themselves amid the third and final step, expulsion. In July of 2019, Leslie and Angie gave a walking tour of Moravia while telling the history of the Moravia Resiste movement. The girls proudly showed off the streets of Moravia where they grew up, pointing out local businesses, attractions, and friends. For Leslie and Angie and all Moravitas, resistance and resilience is a fact of life. As their community faces new threats, the Moravia Resiste movement has been revitalized and continues to act as a vehicle of community advocacy. This is what the movement looks like today. Notice that behind the woman, there are large leaves and flowers that bring the botanical gardens to mind. They spell out amor, love, making it clear the love Moravitas have for their neighborhood. This is a resistance movement built on love. Here we see a tribute to the presence and influence of Afro-Colombians living in Moravia. Vicente Mejia was known as the priest of the garbage dump. He was an organizer of protest movements and a revolutionary from 1960 until he was forced to flee the country in 1979. The results of our research point to three failures of social urbanism policy and its implementation in Medellin. The first is that the policies fail to include the target population in a meaningful way. This is evident by the resurgence of the Moravia Resiste movement, where Moravitas must publicly demonstrate in order to have their voice heard. The second failure of this policy is its appropriation of Moravita culture. The local government of Colombia has used Moravia's history of resilience and resistance as a brand for the neighborhood, which in practice acts as a tool to increase tourism and facilitate gentrification. Lastly, the implementation of social urbanism policies by the local government has perpetuated and not reduced social and geographical segregation of the city. where the most affluent people live in the renovated, vibrant city center, and the poorest individuals live on the outside of the city without access to public spaces, social services, or employment opportunities. From our research, we made the following conclusions. Despite the apparent success of social urbanism as an urban planning and neighborhood upgrading policy, it ultimately fails as a social justice policy, where the most underserved populations have been forced to bear the marginal costs of the policies in the form of displacement. The process in which Medellin and Moravia specifically has been upgraded and gentrified can be identified as urban colonization, where the area of Moravia has been stigmatized, speculated, and now gentrified. Lastly, the Moravia Resiste movement continues to be a vehicle of advocacy and resistance in Moravia and continues to shape public response to undesirable local policies. These are my works cited, and thank you so much for watching.